Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Royal Television Society's London's talk on how legal and commercial teams have responded to COVID-19. My name is Nana Dwodu, and I will be moderating this session. By way of background, I worked in content distribution at Disney, HIT, and Mattel. So TV production faced unprecedented challenges during COVID-19, and last March had to lock down and shut filming. But at the same time, we had soaps like EastEnders and Coronation Street predict that they were going to run out of new episodes by June. But at the same time as that, we had people working from home and we had schools shut. So there was more demand for content than ever before. So joining me to discuss these issues, we have Olusoga Adamo, who is Head of Business Affairs at ITV Studios, Damien Kent, Vice President for Legal and Business Affairs Scripted at Fremantle, Catriona Roos, who is TV and Film Associate at law firm Harbottle and Lewis, and Nick Smith, Executive Vice President for Formats at All Free Media International. So thanks for everyone for joining. So this discussion, so just before we jump into this discussion, we're just going to have a quick look at shows that were able to be filmed during the pandemic. So really, really gripping and fun stuff. Okay, so before we get into the panel discussion, just to let you know the format for today. So we will have the panel talking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have the chance for audience to ask their questions. So please put your questions through to the YouTube chat. Okay. All right. So to kick off, can you take us through some of the key impacts on television programming and production as a result of the pandemic? And just tell us a bit about how the response was managed, personally for you and at your org. Olusoga, do you want to start?
Thanks for having me. Well, last year during the height of the pandemic, I was working for two non-scripted labels within ITV Studios. One was ITV Daytime, responsible for most of their daytime programming from GMB to This Morning, and also a factual label called Multi-Story Media. So some of our productions were actually left intact. Actually, we were still able to produce, and ITV was still able to broadcast those productions. But obviously, we had to find new ways of working from home, with children being at home. We all had to get used to that blurred line between work and non-work life. So productivity was quite a big impact on definitely members of my team and my immediate colleagues, and just how to deal with that level of productivity and the level of work that was required, just to make sure that we didn't lose further commissions, and what we could do just to make sure that those commissions that were suspended, there was a way around that. So productivity and the impact, and just new ways of working from home, that was quite a big deal for us. But I think we managed it very well.
Oh, thanks for that. Why don't we go to you, Damien?
Sure. I think picking up on Sugar's point at the end there about productions having to suspend, I think largely the first things was essentially productions had to be suspended or stood down generally. So that meant looking at cast contracts, crew contracts, supplier, facility services, venues that were hired, all involved looking at the contracts for these agreements and seeing for example, was there a situation where COVID would be covered under the terms of the agreement? What payments would need to be made if so? Generally, COVID wasn't wrapped into sort of force majeure clauses, which I'll get into a bit later. I think some of the questions go to that, but generally COVID isn't a scenario that anyone foresaw. So it meant going back to broadcasters as producers and agreeing what payments would need to be made to essentially get out of these contracts. And it meant in some cases paying the contract to the very end. In some cases it meant agreeing a compromise position where you pay a certain stand down cost. So it was more expensive, and additional costs on the budget. Last year I worked at a multi-genre company, so I was across entertainment shows, scripted programming, as well as factual. And entertainment shows, of course, you can't have audiences, and generally today you can't. So one of the workarounds is seeing where you can contract directly certain members of the public to be part of the editorial rather than as an audience. So big shows like Britain's Got Talent and X Factor, you generally can't film those sorts of shows. And I worked on a number of shows for various broadcasters that stopped for that reason, because it required an audience to make the show. Documentaries and factual can largely continue because you're having one-to-one interviews and talking heads, so you can socially distance and do that safely. And drama requires so much cast quarantining prior to, because you've got different people mixing. Obviously, no one's from the same household, so there's a testing regime prior to and throughout the. And hence, if you look at Gogglebox, you're generally filming with households, so there's no real worry there about the people you're working with. But of course, you need to do your due diligence and health and safety checks and testing with crews that are entering the houses to film, etc. So a mixed experience across the genres, really.
Okay, thank you so much. Catriona, why don't we go to you?
Thanks, Nana. So I'm obviously approaching this a little bit differently to the others on the panel, because I'm in private practice. So we were advising a kind of broad range of kind of TV producer clients who are obviously affected by the pandemic. So in terms of just drawing some of the themes out there that we were seeing, so some of those were obviously producers grappling with dealing with new ways of working, in compliance with the various enhanced kind of health and safety measures that had to be put in place. Producers really thinking outside of the box, considering more expensive outside location shooting, working with smaller crews, using fewer extras. And then secondly, obviously we're advised on contracts, both contracts that had been entered into already at the time of the pandemic, and then also thinking kind of ahead in terms of what changes needed to be made to kind of contract templates to kind of deal with this new reality going forward. And then just the last point, there was obviously a lot of kind of changing government rules and guidance, and we were just on an ongoing basis advising producers on those and how best to deal with their kind of practical and legal implications. So yeah, that's it for me.
Okay, perfect. And Nick.
So yeah, I'd concur with the other views. We've faced a lot of the same issues, but maybe something different that I could talk about is working for the distribution arm of All3Media. We deal with broadcasters all around the world, and they've had massive holes appear in their schedules because of the pandemic, with events being cancelled, such as the European Football Championships and the Olympics and Eurovision. I know that might be maybe a little bit of a laughing stock in the UK, but it's taken very seriously throughout Europe. And so that actually presented a bit of an opportunity because there was a market for either tape sales, ready-made programs to be sold to broadcasters, or for them to commission formats that could be made during the pandemic. So I guess looking at it as some upside in amongst all the kind of horrific changes that happen.
Okay, great. So that kind of sort of leads on to the next question, where we talk about how was the shortfall in programming sort of dealt with, because obviously that would have been a huge challenge, and we obviously saw that there are opportunities to be able to still do things like Gogglebox or the Cube, but like how do you want to speak to what other challenges that you faced in terms of trying to fix this shortfall in programming? Should we start with Olusoga?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, it was very fortunate with the labels I was working with. A lot of our productions were able to continue. For example, GMB, and this morning they had to change format and they had to change several of our protocols, and it was a real testament to some of my colleagues that actually managed to do all of that within a short space of time. So that in itself was a challenge. And I suppose with the shortfall in content for broadcasters, it was really a case of having to look back at our sort of chest of content things that we had made and we still had the rights to, could we repackage those? And if we could we do it for the right price? And were there people available? And could we get to the facilities in order to do that? Or did we need to somehow get editing facilities offsite or in people's homes? So that was challenging. But there were opportunities there. There were opportunities to look at our old catalogue and maybe to have that content on. So although people maybe roll their eyes like Charlie from Casualty at the fact of seeing lots of repeats on television, but the fact is that there was content there, but it just had to be changed, and we just had to make sure that the necessary rights were either there or were subsequently acquired in order for that broadcast to take place.
Thank you. Damien, did you have anything to add?
Sure, I think just in terms of challenge of just running as a business, certain unscripted producers, not to speak for everyone or too soon, but I think certainly for unscripted producers, particularly that are relying on entertainment programming or audiences or public audiences to attend recording, and that rely on quick turnaround volume productions, I think is really damaging. There's smaller margins on non-scripted shows, generally speaking, and so when a business model is set up to rely on non-scripted shows and volume shows throughout the year, and you don't have broadcasters ordering shows, it's really damaging. And from speaking to colleagues in the industry, I think scripted producers seem to have a better time of it. They have longer lead time in the development and production process. It takes a long time to get something from script to screen. So the model is set up slightly differently, and it seemed, at least from a revenue, furlough, salary reduction perspective, I think scripted producers seemed to fare better from what I hear. From a commercial point of view, I think it made producers, and certainly unscripted producers, consider their portfolio of programming and what programs could be sort of safely made in the pandemic while also retaining editorial quality. From a legal point of view, there's not much that could really be done apart from consider your contracts when you're looking to re-engage studios, cast, supply, etc., to make sure you've got the flexibility to exit contracts as and when you need to, should the situation worsen again, and also consider really carefully at whose cost, whether the producer pays it or whether the money can be recovered from the cast at the point of needing to exit.
Okay, cool. Nick, did you have anything you wanted to sort of add in terms of how shortfall in programming was addressed?
Sure. Well, I guess we can. There are certain shows that there's just nothing that you can do to keep them on air. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, we had, for example, Race Across the World, which launched a new series at the beginning of this year on BBC Two. And a Danish version in Denmark that we're doing really successfully, and both broadcasters want more. At the moment, obviously, traveling around the world is not something that you can make COVID safe. So there's no way to save that program. But we've had to work hard on other programming to find ways to adapt them so that they can continue on air. We've been very successful with Gogglebox. Normally the production crew are in another room in the participants' homes. Now, or during the midst of the pandemic, when it was being filmed, the production crews would be outside in vehicles, and they just had to do some practical things like hire portaloos, so that the production crew had facilities to use where they couldn't use the facilities in the participants' homes anymore. And yeah, I think it just created more. We had to just be a bit creative in terms of looking for opportunities. We have a show that aired on Channel 4 called Celebrity Call Centre, and we were able to get that commissioned in the US, where the celebrities took the phone calls from home, and we created a virtual call centre rather than them actually going to a location. It was recorded mainly in LA, which was really badly hit by the pandemic. So I think it's just been about being adaptable and creative to make things work during this tough time.
Sounds like quite a lot of sort of forward thinking was required. Okay, so my next question was about whether there were any sort of key contractual changes that needed to happen at the height of the pandemic, and I guess particularly with the first lockdown. Katrine, is that something you'll be able to speak about?
Was that for me and Anna? Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So just a couple of points that I'll draw out. So firstly, it was kind of dealing with kind of new COVID policies and procedures, and kind of making sure that contracts were drafted broadly enough to kind of cover compliance with the new kind of policies and procedures that producers were putting in place on set. Whereby kind of cast and crew were having to consent to testing and temperature checks and that kind of thing. And if existing contracts weren't broad enough to cover that, then kind of making amendments to those to reflect those types of changes. Kind of force majeure is another obvious one, and I'm sure others on the panel will touch on this as well. But kind of asking yourself, does COVID fall within the definition of force majeure? Force majeure isn't a term that has a kind of standard meaning across all contracts. It can be defined slightly differently in every single contract. So it really was a case of kind of looking at lots of different contracts of lots of different producers in terms of our advice. We got asked very often whether whether COVID was an act of God, which is a phrase that's often referenced in force majeure clauses. And generally the answer was no to that question. And then also another tricky thing that is specific to this pandemic is that obviously when it first happened, in some circumstances that definitely would have been a force majeure event. But then considering whether kind of the repeated lockdowns and the repeated events that were happening throughout last year and continuing now, does that continue to be a force majeure event even though it's now a kind of known pandemic? And then suspension, does the contract allow the producer to suspend engagements following a force majeure event? Do individuals have to be paid during that period of suspension? And also just considering whether the force majeure clause kind of allows suspension and termination for force majeure, where performance of the contract hasn't just become kind of impossible, but actually it's just become harder and more expensive, and whether that, producers can kind of rely on that in that situation.
Okay, perfect. Damien, did you want to jump in?
Nothing additional to add, really sort of succinctly answered, and sort of the points I would have mentioned. So
Okay, perfect. Okay, so what legal considerations needed to be taken into account to get productions restarted? Who wants to have the bat on that one? Olusoga or Damien?
No, I can go on that one. I mean, there are many. Producers would need to ask themselves lots of questions. Can the production actually be adequately funded, and what terms do you need to sort of incorporate into your agreement just to make sure that that does happen, and who's going to pick up any costs that have been incurred as a result of suspension or even maybe abandonment. And in fact, can the production be legally made? Can you actually contract individuals that you want in that production, or that the broadcaster tells you, that this production is key with this broadcast, with this presenter or this contributor, but you have to bring that presenter or contributor from an overseas country. We had that on occasion, and the whole thing about self-isolating and is it safe to bring them, because obviously you don't want to put just them at risk, you don't want to put the rest of your crew at risk and have any liability there. So can you actually make a production effectively and protect your cast and crew, and in most cases, despite your best efforts, if you can't do that, then what happens, and what does that speak to in terms of liability? And other issues such as can you actually film or get to film or get your cast and crew to specific locations? So all of that can somehow either lead to costs or somehow lead to you having increased liability. So those are some of the considerations. There I'm sure are others, but some of the considerations to bear in mind when you're restarting your production again, or a new production has just been commissioned.
Should we go to Damien next? what did you find were the legal considerations that needed to take into account to have programming be able to start again?
Yeah, I think, Sugar outlines sort of this really salient points there and salient considerations. I think ultimately it's just worth stressing, of course, as employers and as engagers of talent and crew, there's obviously a duty of care owed. So, of course, even if you sort of set your place and plan to be able to make the show and you're legally able to do it within the parameters of current government guidelines, etc., it's still making sure that you're following the processes rigidly, and particularly if you're bringing people from overseas and you're looking at the COVID position there and then getting them in to the border. I worked on a show where we had US talent last year coming in to work on UK show, and that meant various conversations with the insurer to make sure that generally production insurance wasn't vitiated. It's all very difficult, and of course people have been now bringing on board COVID supervisors to make sure that the plans are followed and in place, because of course your broadcasters are also requiring you to follow your plans and measures and any government guidance, because otherwise that also might prevent you getting the funding you need from the broadcaster. So it's those sort of commercial considerations coupled with the legal, really, to be able to, I guess, get back into production safely and feasibly.
Okay, perfect. Katrin, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
I'll just add just one point that we also saw kind of crop up a couple of times in terms of productions getting restarted again, were kind of questions around kind of data protection, and just kind of thinking about whether the gathering of additional kind of health data that was required under lots of the guidelines, for example, kind of body temperatures, recording underlying health conditions of certain crew members or cast members and even their family members and that kind of thing. And what we also saw was lots of producers were kind of hiring kind of testing suppliers who were gathering that type of medical data, and just again considering whether those kind of third parties were gathering kind of medical data in the right way, and also just making sure that processes were in place to make sure that the wider production team, didn't have access to more personal data than was strictly necessary. So yeah, I think the data protection angle is also something that we were kind of grappling with at the time.
Actually, that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about the sort of data protection issues. So thank you so much for sort of speaking to that. Okay, so one thing I've been really curious about is how supported the industry has felt by the government generally. And I know that one of the things they brought into place was something called the Production Restart Scheme. So Katrin, would you be able to talk about that?
Yeah, of course. So obviously insurance became a really big problem for productions, kind of trying to get back on track. And producers were finding it impossible in some cases to get insurance cover for COVID-related losses, and that meant that financiers just weren't funding productions, and so that kind of ultimately led the government to kind of launch the Production Restart Scheme to kind of help producers who couldn't start or kind of restart production due to this lack of availability of insurance coverage, by making kind of direct compensation available to cover these kind of COVID-related losses. So the scheme, there's a lot to it, and there's a lot of information out there about the scheme, but just kind of try and kind of condense it a little bit. But basically, to qualify for the scheme, a production has to kind of tick various boxes, including that the production company has to be resident in the UK for tax purposes. The production kind of has to meet the UK cultural test, and at least 50% of the production budget has to be spent in the UK. And those are just a kind of couple of examples. As a producer, you have to provide evidence that you haven't been able to obtain that kind of insurance cover for COVID-related risks on commercially viable terms. And there's other restrictions around the scheme. So the maximum a production can claim under the scheme is £5 million. There's a fee to participate of 1% of the production budget. And also only certain losses are covered. So the main losses are where kind of key cast or crew members contract the virus, or they need to take time off because an immediate family member contracted the virus. and also kind of losses caused by the various lockdowns that were put in place, for example, where productions couldn't kind of get into locations because of this restrictions put in place, or because kind of key members of kind of cast or crew had to self-isolate in line with government guidance. So again, there's various other requirements and exclusions around kind of testing, complying with the BFC industry guidance, kind of having diversity policies in place, and again, there's lots of other examples. So the scheme currently applies to productions that commence filming before the end of April this year, and that date has kind of been moved a couple of times, and it's now at the moment currently set to cover losses incurred by producers up until the end of June this year, and we'll obviously see if the government pushes that date again. Just a general comment, it was obviously set up in the right, kind of as a step in the right direction from the government, but as a result of the rules being quite onerous, the uptake hasn't kind of, in our experience, been quite as widespread as expected.
Yeah, that's actually, it's really, really helpful to kind of get the bit of background to that, because I've heard it mentioned but didn't know much about it. Olusoga, have you got anything to add about the production restart scheme, or just generally how you feel like the arts industry has been supported during this pandemic?
Well, I think it was covered very succinctly just before. But one thing I would add is there is a bit of a kicker in terms of what would happen if a producer had to make a claim for abandonment, because in that respect, if the scheme paid out, then the DCMS, who manage the scheme, although it's sort of administered through a different agency, the DCMS can actually ask you to hand over all the rights in your production. So all the IP in your production, that could go to the DCMS, or they could ask you to give a legally binding undertaking that you won't either sell or transfer or somehow exploit the IP in that production for a period of 10 years, unless you pay back the money that they paid out to you under the scheme. So, that's sort of tucked in quite close to the end of all the scheme rules. So, it's good that the government have provided that scheme after being lobbied by the industry. And in fact, some of my colleagues at ITV, including Magnus Brook, were quite key in achieving that. But there is this sort of kicker, for want of a better phrase, if you did actually make a claim for abandonment under the scheme. So producers do need to be careful as to whether or not they feel it's actually appropriate to take out protection under that scheme.
Okay, so typically in sort of March, October, you tend to have your sort of trade industry events. So you'd have like your MIP, or you'd have Cannes and things like that. Obviously, that had to be cancelled last year, and I'm hearing that will be cancelled again. So do you think that there are any sort of pros and cons of not being able to do the normal trade festivals or upfront screenings? Nick, I imagine that's maybe something you will tend to sort of travel for.
Sure, yes. As a distribution business, we do a lot of traveling to festivals and to markets all over the world, and pretty much all of them have had to move on to online, or to postpone or cancel. And yet there have been pros and cons for that. In a light-hearted way, I guess I could say one pro has been that I've been traveling to Cannes twice a year for the last nearly 15 years, for a week each time. And it's been a bit like, being dragged on the same family holiday with your parents every year. So I was quite sick of Cannes and quite happy not to have to go this time. But now that it's been a whole year of 2020 of not being in Cannes, I miss it and want to get back. But on more seriously, I think the pros would be that there's been a lot of money saved, not just in terms of the cost of travel and subsistence, but to take a stand at a market is eye-wateringly expensive. So that's been money that's been saved. It's also been an opportunity to speak directly, to have maybe more longer conversations with buyers and partners. and be in their homes. You know, you kind of get that connection of, you know, Zoom calls being they're not so rushed as they can be if you're you know, at a festival where there's a lot of noise and a lot of other people around and a lot of other meetings to rush into. So I guess those would be some positives. Negative side, I think it's a lot harder to make a big noise. At a market, you can have poster boards, you can have screenings. There's just general buzz. People talk to each other when they've seen something good, and it kind of spreads around. That doesn't happen when you're trying to conduct things virtually. And I think nothing really beats physical interaction. I don't think, although I'm sure, and we'll probably get onto this, I'm sure that the industry will change given what we've all learned about what we can do from home and what we can do on Teams and Zoom and you know, other video conferencing systems. I don't think anybody wants to never go back to meeting people in person again. I think we all probably miss that. So I think, you know, those are kind of some of the key pros and cons. Oh, and so I guess one other thing would be that you know, for us as a, you know, established big distributor, it's not been so bad to miss the markets because the buyers still want to see us and we have those relationships. But if you're a newer company, or if you have a newer project that you were hoping to take out and to get interested in, to get and to pitch, then you're really at a disadvantage trying to, you know, start these conversations from scratch and trying to get into people's you know, to get into people to take you seriously when you know, you couldn't meet them in the flesh. So that's a challenge.
Okay. Yeah, no, it'd be interesting to see how things sort of change going forward, because I can sort of definitely see that a lot of workplaces will probably encourage way more working from home, and you just kind of think, will the industry want to sort of cut some of the costs that you have with, you know, all the big entertaining that they do at things like Cannes by sort of replacing it with virtual screening. So yeah, I know it's quite interesting. So we just actually had a question in from the audience about health and safety checks, and I just kind of wanted to just ask that off the back of what Katrine was speaking about in terms of the health information that people have to give. So someone has asked whether health and safety checks now include COVID testing. Is that something that you're able to answer, Katrine, or perhaps Damien?
I mean, I'm not sure I can answer it properly, but because I can't actually recall if under the BFC guidelines you have to do testing, and health and safety legislation is actually quite separate really to all of the industry guidelines and the industry guidance. So I think that's the kind of first thing. It probably isn't a requirement under health and safety legislation, but I imagine it is a requirement under the kind of BFC guidelines. Okay, thanks. Hopefully that's helped to answer your question. Okay, and then the next thing I wanted to kind of look at is sort of talking about streaming services, because obviously with so many people at home, I think, you know, demand for content, as we spoke about earlier, has probably been like never before. And you know, obviously we've seen during this period people like Disney Plus get so many new subscribers. I think they've hit something like well, I know Netflix has hit something like 200 million globally, and I don't think that Disney Plus is that far behind. So it seems like they've been some of the big winners in the industry, streaming services. What do you think will be some of the sort of key learnings for content businesses, especially those which have streaming services as a result of the pandemic? Nick, is that something you would be able to speak to?
Sure. I think it may be a little bit early to say that the streaming services have been the big winners. Certainly streaming has become more and more popular, and there's more and more streaming services out there. But profitability is, I guess, a different question. I think actually maybe the big winners have been producers and distributors. Within the All 3 Media Group, I know that we've got a number of things that have either been produced or in production for the big streaming services with really high budgets, higher than we would have been able to get from a UK domestic broadcaster typically. And I think there are more opportunities out there because there are more buyers with all these streaming services that have launched, and they're desperate for content because they don't just have to fill a traditional TV grid. They need to have something for everybody at all times. So I think us as producers and distributors have been the winners. We'll have to wait and see which of the streaming services will end up winning the battle, because my guess is that not all of them will survive. I'm not sure that the public are willing to pay for as many streaming services as there are out there, and maybe not as many as they're paying for now in the midst of a pandemic when they have a lot of time to watch. When things go back to normal, maybe they'll cut down and only focus on 1 or 2 streaming sites, and maybe then we've already seen that Quibi has kind of failed and that's gone. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with some more niche streaming sites. So the founder of Spun Gold has launched True Royalty, which is a VOD platform about royal content. The producers World of Wonder have launched WOW Plus, which is a niche VOD service for some of the content they produce. So I think that will be an interesting thing to watch develop. But who the winners will be, watch this space.
Remains to be seen. Okay. So what do you, as a group, see as some of the sort of key opportunities for the industry in the sort of post COVID climate? I think Nick sort of touched on some things, and obviously it's a great opportunity for producers because there is this demand for content. But what do you think are sort of the other opportunities? I think I'll kick off with Damien, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's probably early still, and I think there's a lot of businesses, particularly those who have been greatly impacted and have had to sort of stop filming and consider the programs they have, particularly those that require audiences, particularly those that require lots of people on set, for example, and to be mixed, it creates difficulties. And so I think perhaps one of the opportunities is for a business to sort of look at its portfolio programming, consider the makeup of that, the formats, and perhaps rejig and perhaps widen the type of programming they produce. Of course, that is sort of a longer game. But I think that is perhaps a potential opportunity. Like I said, I think at the moment it's still quite challenging and quite difficult. And I can't quite think of all of the sort of great opportunities that are coming from it as yet. I think what it has caused businesses to perhaps do is sort of slow down a bit and just perhaps consider the way in which we're working, because I think from a human perspective, it's been challenging on the psyche, I think, and I think it's made all of us realise that we can do our jobs from home, we can work in a remote way, we can all get together and still produce amazing content with much effort, and some difficulties and some hurdles. So I think it's also perhaps made people be a bit more human, because I think you get on like this, you see everyone, and I think it's sort of hopefully maybe in some way connected us all a bit more in a together way. So hopefully more human connection, and from a business sense, perhaps just to consider portfolio and different type of content that can be made, I think, under the circumstances.
Okay, great. Olusoga?
I would reiterate what Damien has just said. I think we need to embrace more flexible working, because it's all been proven that it can be done. And post-COVID, I'm sort of very much looking forward, not to returning to exactly how things were, but to a better situation and a better world, without sounding a bit too sort of airy-fairy. I think we should take the opportunity where we can, not to travel by plane, or have that meeting on Zoom. I think we all know Zoom meetings or Hangouts or Teams or whatever it is we're having, they can be very, very tiring. But in terms of the environment, if you can have a meeting rather than flying to LA over Zoom, then good for the production budget and good for the environment. So I'm very much looking forward to maybe some of those things continuing, so long as it doesn't have an adverse effect on our health.
Katrine?
Yeah, I'll just add one or 2 points, maybe. Obviously a lot has already been covered, but I think one opportunity for the industry kind of post-COVID is going to be to maintain a focus on mental health. I think that almost kind of fits in quite nicely with kind of the flexible working regime, which we're all now so familiar with. But I do think that hopefully the recognition that some work can actually be done quite effectively from home may actually lead to a better kind of work-life balance, kind of for some crew members, for example. But I do think mental health is a good one for the industry to kind of, take forward post-COVID. And then the other thing is actually wrapping up a bit with Me Too, but the requirement to maintain physical distance has obviously changed a lot of practices on set. And the hope is that this can actually lead to some of the anti-harassment measures that people have been talking about and trying to put in place having actually more meaningful impact. And then just related to that, obviously filming of kind of intimate scenes have been handled very differently during the pandemic, and obviously hopefully that will actually lead to a kind of a longer term change in the way that those kinds of scenes are handled.
Okay, that's actually a really, really good point, which I hadn't thought about. So thank you so much for bringing that up. That's amazing. Okay, so we're starting to get a few more audience questions in, and I think it's in about time for them to have a chance to answer questions. So one of the questions we've had through from the YouTube chat is, has COVID changed strategic approaches in regards to format buying and selling? Are people looking to diversity more, or are they more cautious about shows with live audiences? So that's just coming from Ilana. Who wants to kick off with that? Is that actually, Nick, is that something you could speak to, because it's sort of focused on format buying?
Sure. I would say I'm not sure that the pandemic has had an effect on diversity. I think there's been that's already kind of something that broadcasters, not just in the UK, and producers as well, have been focusing on for the last little period of time, and I think we're starting to see change in that, which is great to see. I'm not sure if that's been brought about by the pandemic. I think what has happened, it's maybe the fact that meetings can take place have to take place at the moment on video conferencing, I think has opened up the playing field a little bit. It's meant especially that producers, if we talk about the UK, producers in the regions haven't got to maybe travel down to London all the time to try and get a meeting with broadcasters. So I think that's made a big difference, and it's made it easier for lots of people to access commissioners. So I think that means that there'll be maybe some different voices, or you'll see more of them on TV from different production companies in different regions. I can't see the question anymore. There was another part to it which I've forgotten. Sorry.
Okay, sorry, let me just pull that up. I guess it was just about whether COVID had changed strategic approaches in regards to format buying and selling, and just are people looking to diversify more, or are they more cautious about shows with live audiences? So
sure,
I think you've dealt with a lot of that.
Yeah, I think it just depends on the country. So we've just had a show in Australia where they had a live audience because they were able to do that, but it just depends on regulations in the different countries. I guess one thing in terms of format buying and selling, I think again it just comes down to what is practically possible. I think what it has done is opened up opportunities for new shows. So in the Netherlands, where Survivor is a very successful show, they haven't been able to record that. And so we've been commissioned with a new reality show, and that slot may not have been open to us had Survivor been able to be produced as per normal.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Okay, we've had another question through, and this one is about force majeure. So maybe Katrine and maybe perhaps Damien can look into this one. So the question is, has COVID changed strategic approaches in regards to format, buying and selling? Oh, sorry, no. Have you found any areas where recompense for the impact of COVID-19 has been successfully reclaimed through pre-COVID insurance policies? So that's a question from Tim on force majeure and acts of God. Sorry, I know I had got the wrong question initially. So do you want me to repeat that, or do you got that?
I think I've got that.
So, okay. Okay,
I was going to say, to my knowledge, and Katrine may have sort of a different answer, but to my knowledge, I'm not aware of anyone being able to sort of claim, particularly at the height of the pandemic when everyone had to immediately suspend and terminate. I'm not aware of anyone that was able to go to the relevant policy and say, hey, this has happened, can you pay out on this? I think what everyone had to do was essentially work out what the relevant costs were to suspend, go to the broadcaster cap in hand and say, these are our committed costs at this stage. And generally the position is, if you're terminating, most broadcasters will pay all costs that you've committed to and can't get out of at the point of having to suspend or terminate. Normally in your waterfall or in contracting, equally, you're only liable to pay those monies up to the point that you're suspending or terminating their contract. So it flows down in the waterfall. So really it was going to the broadcasters and saying, we need this money from you because we're committed to these costs at X date of terminating the contracts we couldn't get out of, essentially. So I'm not aware of anyone getting money from insurers. I don't know if you have a different position on that, Katrine.
No, that's exactly what I understood as well, Damien. So yeah, totally agree with that.
Okay. Actually, something that I was quite interested in, just to skip in again into the main question person, is I wanted to know whether there'd been any sort of new models that you had sort of seen being introduced as a result of what's happened with the pandemic.
Do you mean from like a rights or like a contracting perspective?
Yeah, for, whether business or in terms of contracts.
I think from a rights perspective, I think broadcasters are still asking for what rights they want. I think what you're seeing typically, though, is just conditions to funding, so that they have a COVID sort of mitigation policy in place, that they have eligibility to the restart scheme. I think broadcasters are requiring that you follow your policies throughout. And generally, broadcasters have always had generally an existing right to take over. So of course there are real costs at stake. So producers are balancing running a business. And so if they were to go bust, broadcasters generally have a right of takeover, so they can step in to the shoes of the broadcaster and complete the production, because ultimately broadcasters want the product they're funding. So those protections still exist for the broadcaster. I don't think the rights they're requesting has changed. But in terms of a contracting perspective, I think the key is flexibility in trying to, being able to get out of contracts in the event things go hairy and horrible for the nation again. So, I worked on a number of studio hires last year where typically they would say, COVID's not an event of force majeure. So if COVID happens, a COVID event happens and you need to pay right to the contract, ultimately the business media runs on relationships. Ultimately you want repeat business. So it's sort of, you're coming together to reach a fair compromise. So you're just building in flexibility to terminate and ultimately trying to reach a position of paying what costs are fair to pay, so that the relevant person you've engaged isn't completely out of pocket, particularly if it's a services company. And also that as a producer, you're not bearing more than what the budget could already handle anyway. So I think it's just really being upfront with your contracts and building in what are fair and flexible to sort of termination and exit policies and provisions.
I think Damien's absolutely right. And I would add to that, even though your force majeure clause is there, sometimes it really just comes down to having sensible discussions either between producer and broadcaster or producer and talent as to, how we can make this work and to take account of the situation. To variable success, sometimes that has worked, and either the broadcaster or the contributor or presenter whom you're contracting with has been sensible, and there has been a fair compromise which has been reached. But in other times that hasn't been achieved. One thing I would add, and this goes to the point of the insurance scheme, is that obviously it was always the case that a producer would always wish to get their production agreement signed before committing to production or before production started. But it's one of the requirements of the scheme to make absolutely sure that when you hand in your scheme application, you've also got a production contract. And that in itself, that puts more pressure on the producer to get that contract agreed or get that trust letter agreed. And it may well be that in doing so, negotiations are short-circuited, and the producer ends up agreeing terms that the producer would otherwise not agree, or perhaps if there was more time to have that negotiation, maybe they would have come to a better compromise. And the fact that it is agreed in that production agreement, it could well be a bit of a yoke around the neck for when the producer and broadcaster subsequently contract for a second series. So that I think has put some pressure on producers, just to make sure that that production contract or production agreement or whatever it is that you have with your broadcaster is agreed sooner rather than later.
Okay, so I think we have probably our last question, which has just come through on the audience. So, in light of COVID restrictions, when filming an interview in a contributor's home, are we still seeing use of standard contributor agreements or additional paperwork? So that's just come through from Nick. Who wants to bat that one out? Is that something that you can speak to, Katrine, or maybe Damien?
So I haven't seen myself any kind of additional specific paperwork. I think most kind of contributor agreements will include consent, obviously, for that, for the team to be in your home. So like from my experience, I haven't seen anything kind of above and beyond that specifically to deal with. Specifically to address COVID, because I think generally contributor agreements are drafted quite broadly and cover off all the consents that the crew and the producer would need to do the filming. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, Shoga may add some additions to what I say, but I'm sure he's sort of largely seen the same. Ultimately, your contributor agreements remain the same, but PACs generally have issued guidance, and I think one of the key things including is just an awareness of risk. So we're all operating in a world where we know COVID is currently happening and is upon us. So ultimately, we're all actively and of our own volition agreeing to be a part of the production. So you're just adding sort of awareness of risk language, and you're adding in language into your agreements that ultimately the producer has policies in place to mitigate anyone contracting COVID, and you make that available to the relevant contributors that they need to comply with it also. And generally you're requesting contributors to have a period of self-isolation before they film. So of course you can tease out if anyone's got any symptoms that may develop in the period before filming. And then again, just building in your flexibility to suspend or terminate if someone suddenly does present symptoms, so that you're not bound to then essentially pay out any monies if, of course, it's a fee paid contributor. So I think it's more just building in the fact that you've got policies in place that they need to follow, and that they're aware that there are risks in taking part in the production.
Okay, perfect. Olusoga, I'm not sure if you had anything to add to that. We've got maybe 1 minute for the answer for that last question.
Only that where possible, we've tried to avoid filming in people's